And that brings me on to the next item on the agenda. The special report in the discharge process. And this concerns the fishing fleet capacity. I'd like to start by giving the floor to Marta Andreasen, the Rapporteur. Ms. Andreasen, you have the floor to present your report.
Thank you, Chair. Well, the title of this report is How have EU measures contributed to adapting the capacity of fishing fleets to available fishing opportunities? The simple answer is that the measures have not contributed to achieve this goal. The European Court of Auditors has issued a damning appraisal of measures taken by the Commission and the Member States. The common fisheries policy intends to promote sustainable fishing, but the reduction of fishing overcapacity has simply not happened. Fish catches have declined by 1 million tonnes, up to 100,000 jobs have been lost, and eventually 1.7 billion euro have been wasted since 2002 in vessel decommissioning. Now, the important thing is, in regards discharge for 2011, what has been the responsibility on the Commission on this? Well, firstly, the Commission has failed to define and quantify properly fishing overcapacity, assigning fishing capacity to fishing opportunities. Secondly, there are no clear rules on treatment of fishing rights. Thirdly, there is no clear definition of effective selection criteria for fishing vessel decommissioning schemes. And lastly, the Commission has failed to control the updating of fleet registers. In general terms, Chairman, I agree with the recommendations of the European Court of Auditors. However, I would go further and would refuse to discharge the Commission on the common fishery policies as a whole. I don't think this can be reformed. Further on, I would recommend that the common fisheries policy be discontinued, as it does not provide any value added, and it should be left to Member States. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you, Mrs. Andreasen. Okay, let's open up the debate. Before I give the floor to Mr. Lazaroou from the Court of Auditors, and perhaps there might also be questions to the Commission. And first of all, I'll give the floor to Mrs. Ilianova. Go ahead, Madam.
Mr. Chair, in fact, I would like to speak on behalf of our colleague Fellner, who cannot be here today, and just to express his thanks to Madame Andreasen for her report, and also to the Court for the interesting and relevant information provided. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frau Ivanova. Herr Kollege GEIER.
Thank you, Madam. Mr. Guy now, please. My thanks to the draftsperson and the Court of Auditors too. This is a very critical opinion, and rightly so. It relates, of course, to the common fisheries policy. I agree with the draftsperson that the Court of Auditors has identified the points we need to tackle if we are to make this instrument one that serves the Union. Now, of course, we're in the midst of the reform of the common fisheries policy, and I think it's entirely appropriate for us to be tackling this matter now. The Court of Auditors report is not just valuable in and of itself, it's also really relevant right now, because it might help us create new instruments. As shadow, I agree with a lot of the points made by the Court of Auditors, but I don't entirely agree with the judgment that we should see re-nationalisation. In the relevant committee, we're having a somewhat painful discussion on quotas And the cuts for fishery sectors in member states in my group, it's an especially painful process, but because those that are concerned with the environment have a completely different view to those who come from regions where fisheries is important. So there's a degree of tension. And I think the worst possible solution would be re-nationalisation. It would mean that fleets would be expanded where possible, and they would just basically fish every last fish in the oceans. This won't do anything for sustainability. I think economically and environmentally re-nationalisation is not a good idea, and it certainly makes no sense in terms of sustainability. So re-nationalisation is something that my political group would reject. Thank you. We have the amendments to the opinion. Could I turn to the Court of Auditors? Would you care to give us your view on what we've heard so far in the debate? Go ahead, Mr. Lazaroou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Further to the presentation I made to this committee on the 9th of February, I have nothing further to add. Okay. But I am, however, available to answer to any questions you may have. I also want to say that the European Court of Auditors' task is to bring to the attention of the legislative authorities any problems that may exist in the execution of the European Union budget. And in this case, we are pleased that we are presenting to you the problems that we have encountered based on audit evidence, and presenting, based on such evidence, recommendations and conclusions. So we are not, it's not in our competence to make any political proposals, as it is obvious, and we are very pleased that we are giving you the opportunity to be aware of such problems and discuss and deliberate as to how to proceed to tackle these problems. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Lazaroou.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, the court's report drew the House's attention to precisely this point. And of course, we have to draw the necessary political consequences from reports such as these. Who from the European Commission is here? Yes. Go ahead. Perhaps you might care to say who you are, because we don't have your name. Go ahead. Commission, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dominique, LEVIEIL, and I've been working in DG Mare for 20 years, more than 20 years. Now, I've been appointed to follow the reform, and particularly relations with the European Parliament, the Fisheries Committee and your own committee. Now, on the matter itself, first of all, our thanks for giving us the opportunity to react. And I'll be brief in replying to the 4 points in paragraph 12 by the draftsman. They're the court's conclusions. And 13 on re-nationalisation of the common fisheries policy. And we already heard a view of one member on this. Now, on the 4 court recommendations, allow me to take them in reverse order. Going from the short term to long term, the first recommendation is on the updating on the register, the fleet register. Now, that's very easy and quick to implement. And I point out that anything relating to the updating of this register is in the hands of the European Commission. So if a project is funded by the CFP, is not correctly identified, that is immediately an irregularity, and payments are either interrupted or just quite simply cut off. The second longer-term recommendation relates to the modernization of the fleet without the increasing the ability to catch fish. It's a question of vessel efficiency, their ability to get fish out of the water. This point has been misinterpreted in some member states, and the relevant management authorities didn't flag this or identify this in trying to identify where modernization was going to take place. Now, the Court of Auditors quite rightly meant that the Commission adopted an action program. First of all, we came forward with a legally acceptable interpretation of what efficiency is. It's not just a question of the power of its motor or tonnage or anything like that. And then there's a whole process of verifying that projects already adopted in the member states comply with the condition that they do not increase fishing capacity, that they are more efficient but they don't catch more fish. And also, the idea was to have a permanent mechanism that would ensure that all future projects comply with conditions. Now, this is currently being rolled out. It's not concluded yet. Now, for some member states, this entails a colossal level of work because there are thousands of projects that have to be checked up. So there's a mechanism which has to be implemented, and that, of course, goes hand in hand with administrative costs. The third point, transferable fishing rights and modernization. Now we're looking to the longer term, and this, of course, relates to all the proposals that have been made for the creation of a new fund, the Maritime and Fisheries Fund, that is currently being discussed here in the European Parliament. And the idea would be that modernization projects for vessels be genuinely based on what is genuinely necessary to ensure the fisheries is safer, more sustainable. I would remind you that being a fisherman is the most dangerous job in Europe. The mortality and morbidity rate is extremely high, despite very considerable efforts that have been made to do something about this. So there is a need to keep on encouraging this improvement of working conditions and, of course, promoting the sustainability of fisheries. Final point, reducing capacity. That this has not been as efficient as it might have been. That's clear in the opinion. Now, our proposal is to get rid of the possibility of using community funds for fishing capacity, and that is entirely in line with the Court's recommendation. Now, what the European Parliament produces at the end of its labours will, in large part, or will very greatly influence what we come up with. So you're going to be very influential. Now, I'd like to take up paragraph 13 of Mrs. Andreasen's paper. Here she proposes a re-nationalisation of the fishing policy, so she completely rejects the CFP. Now, there are 3 points I'd make to this. First of all, that the Court of Auditors report relates to one aspect of the common fisheries policy. This is principle number 1 in the CFP. This is aids to vessels temporary stoppages, aids for modernisation, or socio-economic support for fishermen. Now, of the 4.3 billion euros in the CFP, 1.2 billion has been earmarked for this purpose, so a bit less than 30%. The Court of Auditors report relates to part of that 30% and identifies shortcomings which the Commission has taken on board by the Commission in coming forward with proposals to reform the CFP. The Court of Auditors doesn't say that this should be got rid of, less still that the CFP should be done away with. Now, the previous item of the agenda clearly showed that the problems that can arise with other structural funds shouldn't automatically lead to recommendation to get rid of, say, regional development policy or the European Social Fund. Now, specific problems to part of a program lead to a proposal to get rid of the fund altogether. And indeed, not just to get rid of that aspect of the fisheries policy, but all of it, including conservation, modernization of the processing industry, territorial assistance for communities dependent on fisheries, so that these communities can adapt better to the challenges they face, and to deliver on obligations to be sustainable economically and socially. This would be, as I believe is said in English, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There are insufficiencies in a certain part of the fisheries policy, and you propose reject the CFP. Now, we address some of these problems in the new proposals. I really want to emphasize that we shouldn't overlook the fact that the re-nationalisation of the common fisheries policy would lead to situations such as we had before, which were far worse in terms of aid for increasing capacity. Thank you very much.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to the European Commission. Now, we need to ensure here in the committee that EU money is being used correctly, that taxpayers' money is being used correctly and efficiently. That's our fundamental concern as committee. Now, as for political objectives, now obviously there are going to be differences of opinion between groups, and that much is clear. And the point that the Commission just made, that there are good reasons for communitarizing certain policy areas, is something which is broadly shared in the European Parliament, but there are colleagues who have a different view. Now, the Court of Auditors makes a proposal for better use of funds. These have been actively taken up by the European Commission, and they are working with the member states to address these shortcomings as soon as possible. I think that is in the common interest. Okay, to conclude, I'll give the floor to the draftsperson, Mrs. Andreasen.
Thank you, Chair. Well, basically, I would like to come back to some comments made by Mr. GEIER. He says that he opposes re-nationalisation because this would allow fleets to expand, and we would be fishing, every fish in the ocean. Well, I think that this is what is happening right now. We are fishing every fish in the ocean. So I don't think re-nationalisation would do this worse. There was a past when there was no common fisheries policy and member states were operating their own fisheries policy. And this worked well. So why do we have to change it for some system that doesn't work? The Commission says that the European Court of Auditors is referring to one aspect of the common fisheries policy, which is true, and which has a budget of 30% of the total budget for fisheries policy. And that the European Court of Auditors does not say that we should get rid of it. However, I think there are some glaring numbers that we need to consider. I said before that 90% of fish stocks are being overfished. 30% of those are over safe biological limits. Up to 100,000 jobs have been lost. I think these numbers merit a consideration to do away with the policy. And we need to remember that we are considering this in the light of the discharge. And the discharge looks to the past, not to the future. The Commission gives us a lot of responses that envision that the new fisheries policy will provide a solution. Well, at this point in time, we are judging the past. And on the basis of the past, we have to make a decision. Promises are always promises. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau Andreasen. Damit können wir den
Thanks, Mrs. Andreasen. I think we can conclude on that point. We have concluded this morning's agenda. Now, I would remind you that there's a hearing.